Okay, welcome back. I'm still in Puerto Rico, but this one I'm actually in the Castillo looking out at that beautiful water where I am not, unfortunately, now. But I've been there. I swear on my life. All right, so yeah, I took that photo. It's a pretty cool fortress. But like as I said, this isn't a history class, but it's still important to kind of recognize key points of U.S. foreign policy. And this is more on the bureaucracy. I want to focus on that. So one of the biggest things that changed U.S. foreign policy was the National Security Act of 1947, actually on the heels of World War II, or after World War II. I don't know if the heels means after or before. I don't know. People can check that out. But anyways, the National Security Act of 1947 really changed U.S. foreign policy, and without like just knowing the exact things it did, creating the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the CIA, and solidifying the DoD, the Department of Defense, but that later became the Department of Defense. I really want to focus on one aspect here. The goal was two goals: was to create a solid system, not just an ad hoc system. Remember, ad hoc means just created for the moment. So, oh, we need this, we need that for World War II. So with the rise of the Soviet Union, the United States of America said, we need a apparatus of security, right, and foreign policy that is not just relevant for the times, but is solid, efficient, integrated system, not just ad hoc, seat of the pants, oh, we have to do this now. We want a straightforward bureaucracy that continues, right? That's developing. So the goal there, number one, is to not have an ad hoc system, but a system that is essentially stable and developing. So that's where it created like the Joint Chiefs of Staff to coordinate policies, military branches, National Security Council. It said the CIA obviously came out of that. Now the goal isn't a history class. Okay, what did the CIA replace? OSS, all this stuff. That's not important. The goal there is to understand that we wanted, as speaking from a U.S. point of view, a solid system, right? Military to coordinate policy. So we'll have it. And the Soviet Union played a key role with this because after, obviously, this Iron Curtain, we got nervous that this is going to be our next. Although the United States, like in the Allied system, Joseph Stalin became Uncle Joe. We basically said, okay, we need a more system. The other system, which is kind of interesting, is by creating an adversary system, an advisory system, one that advises. The goal, a lot of people don't know, is to curb FDR's power, the power of the president. It actually did the opposite by giving the power to the president to, place people that it liked. So this is one of the problems that's kind of interesting. The goal was to create a system that balanced the power of the presidency because people were nervous about FDR's power. And it actually did the opposite. A lot of analysts think it's that it actually created more power because they can pick and choose all these people, and they become politicized, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But those are the two goals: curb presidential politics and create a stable, efficient system. And then to coordinate policy, you have the defense, Army, Navy, Air Force. You have this National Security Council system, etc. And then you can create acts like the NSC 68 of 1950, approved by Truman, obviously, which tried to create these long-term strategies, not just ad hoc, but long-term strategies with the Soviets, kind of protect and contain. And from that, you've got what we call doctrines, ideas that govern policy. So one of the first doctrines was containment, to contain the Soviet Union. Right? So Truman supported a lot of money with the Marshall Plan. That goal was to beef up these economies and get power in the hands of the United States, that is soft power, which we're going to talk about, showing we can deliver the goods and decreasing the attraction and credibility of what we call communists or fascists, because that's what we were scared of after World War II. So the Marshall Plan was a very, in my opinion, good policy to kind of show the United States is delivering the goods. And, we're helping, don't be against us like with Nazi Germany or communist Soviet Union. So be with us, and to beef up their economies in order to decrease the attraction of the more fascists and communists, right? Be like us. And that's an interesting policy because it goes in the face of the policy of after World War I, which basically just destroyed Germany. We all know the story about how Germany suffered huge inflation. You needed a wheelbarrow full of marks to buy a bread, right? A loaf of bread. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But the point is that we really indebted Germany to the extent to which it was just a disaster. The Polish corridor, we cut Germany in half after World War I, Treaty of Versailles, etc. After the Second World War, we wanted the exact opposite. We wanted like a GI Bill for countries, not just ours, but others, in order to incorporate veterans in education, give them housing, etc. So unlike after World War I, they're not on the streets and then attracted to more extreme ideologies. Now, I kind of go off, you'd be surprised on this in a tangent, but this is very important because after the fall of the Berlin Wall, did we make a mistake with Russia? Meaning when the West won, woohoo, just like I say, woohoo, we beat Spain and everything else. I say that tongue in cheek, but we did win the Cold War. Russia fell into a miserable state. In fact, when I was in Nicaragua, I worked with a lot of Russians, and they'd be like, oh, we're like a third world, right? This is disastrous. And did that create credibility for the rise of Putin? So for me, a lot of people out there will say, oh, Putin apologists, particularly Mearsheimer's and others that, blame the United States and other countries for the invasion of Ukraine because we've been, expanding NATO and other things. But the question is, why do we have two different policies after World War I and World War II? The goal after World War II was to make sure economies did well, right? We didn't really take that approach when the Berlin Wall fell. Now, I'm no spring chicken, although, people look at me and say, what are you, 2022? But after Russia was destroyed, and that's one of the reasons why Belarusian dictator Lukashenko was so popular, and he's still in power now. I don't think he's as popular as before, because they think, I talked to a lot of Belarusians, and they basically were like, well, we don't want to look like Russia, because Russia fell, and all of a sudden there are people in the street. All of a sudden, it was just a disaster economically. All these kind of, oligarchs took over the factories and became rich and all this stuff. It was a disaster. I had a friend from the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, and he said people were selling, drugs in the street because there was no rules, there was no regulation, etc. Should have, if we could have, that is the West, created a better policy towards Eastern Europe, particularly Russia, so the rise of Putin would have been less likely, right? Instead of, just having people in the street, like the elderly, etc. So my argument isn't like pro-Putin, because he has a lot of, I would say, a lot of characteristics like Hitler. But at the same time, the goal after World War II, our policies was to create a world where, embedded liberalism, where we lifted countries up. It seemed to me after the fall of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall, etc., Russia just went boom, and no one really cared. Just like after Afghanistan, after we pulled out of Afghanistan, the Russians and the United States, we said, well, we don't care. The Cold War is over. The Russians were kicked out. We were supporting these very strong Islamic groups. Even Osama bin Laden said, he liked the United States, bring more of the United States to fight the Russians. But then we didn't care after, and the Russians didn't care. No one cared about Afghanistan. And then the Taliban took over. So the question is, after conflict, I think the World War II, we had very good policies in place where we wanted to create a stable system. The World Bank was actually not for developing countries. It was for like the UK, et cetera, it was for reconstruction. The IMF goal was to create a stable exchange rate to keep trade floating. So, because we attribute the lack of trade to the depression, which then created, all this havoc in the world. So the overall goal of US foreign policy in the 1940s, 50s was to create a more stable world. Whereas after the fall of Berlin, after World War I, we just kind of said, well, that's too bad. You're poor, you're poor. So policy matters in foreign policy. And I think we could do other policies that might decrease credibility of people like Putin, Hitler, Mussolini, etc. That's just my opinion. You do not have to agree with me because I'm in Puerto Rico on the beach. So this is something to think about because US foreign policy is policy. What policies are good, what policies are bad? Afghanistan, Iraq, allowing the Taliban, which we did. I mean, no one cared about Afghanistan after the Russians pulled out in after the Cold War. So we didn't care. The only person that cared is Michael Moore. Michael Moore had this show Awful Truth in which he bombed in a fake way Afghanistan with TVs because the Taliban was so fanatic, they actually banned TVs. But you didn't hear much about it. Now, the question becomes, as we talk about this bureaucracy, as we talk about policy, etc., what kind of policies do we have? Right? And is the bureaucracy important? Well, first, I want to stress the doctrines we've had in US foreign policy. At the beginning, we had containment. Just contain the Soviet Union, right? Make sure they don't get into Greece. But then we had brinkmanship, a more fanatical idea that we will go to the brink of war with the Soviet Union. And that was kind of Eisenhower's agreement with the Dulles brothers, who were very fanatical, where Eisenhower was not that fanatical, but he dealt with a very strong right wing within his party. And to kind of appease that, he did a lot of things. And one was brinkmanship. We are ready to go to war with the Soviet Union. And we invaded, unfortunately, two horrible policies, in my opinion. Guatemala, which we invaded in 1954, and then before 1953, Mossadegh in Iran, where we installed brutal dictators, which created massive instabilities in those countries. Now, a lot of people, I talk to students, they say, well, those were the policies we had at the time, we had to do it. No, you don't have to do it. Eisenhower did two other policies, exact opposite, in Costa Rica with Jose Figueres, where the CIA and others wanted to overthrow this guy, Jose Figueres, in Costa Rica. But he decided not to. And also in Bolivia, where there was a very populist kind of left-leaning revolution, and he didn't there either. In fact, his brother convinced him not to in Bolivia. So you had these two policies in there where he worked with these more progressive governments, right? And then he overthrew Arbenz when he could have worked with him, and Mossadegh with whom he could have worked with. But he went to an invasion, and that created conditions for the Shah to be overthrown in 1979 in Iran, which was disastrous. And Arbenz, after overthrowing it, became a civil war. Now, that's very, very important to understand in US foreign policy, because we have decisions and you don't have to make the decisions always. Like, people will always say, well, that's what, it has to be done like that. But that's probably people who support Putin. Oh, the Ukraine has to be invaded, right? No, there are other policies. So for me, working with groups might be better. Now, that doesn't mean you never invade, obviously D-Day and things like that. But there are other policies in US foreign policy that we can do. And with the bureaucracy, there are many different people deciding these things. So for me, it was a big mistake to overthrow Arbenz in 1954. And remember, the United Fruit Company, a la the open door approach, was lobbying the Eisenhower administration. But FDR was getting lobbied to overthrow Cardenas in Mexico when he nationalized the oil industry, and I want to say 1933, 32. So, and that is in Mexico. And FDR said, I'm not going to go in there and invade Mexico and destabilize the country. We might be going into World War II. And remember the Zimmerman telegram from World War I, the Nazis would try to get Mexico on its side. So for FDR, did the good neighbor policy, right? That was the good neighbor. We're not going to invade. So this is one of the issues of US foreign policy. Do we have to invade every country? And the question is no. Do we have to invade some? Well, yeah, you always have to fight, but it has to be more judicial. I don't think, the invasion of Grenada and other countries was necessary. So for me, by working with Jose Figueres in Costa Rica, working with the revolutionary movement in Bolivia in the 1950s, those would do two good policies. But our post-World War II invasion of Guatemala was disastrous. And of Iran, when Mossadegh took power, was disastrous. So we have to start thinking about that. Brinkmanship can be good. I'm going to right about to fight all the time. And that decreases what later became known as soft power by Joseph Nye, a theory that was we can actually attract people not through coercion and killing them by people liking us. And living in Latin America 8 years and going there to Colombia, I noticed that's to be true. People love the United States, the music, jeans, etc. They just like the United States, so they want to be part of the United States and follow policy, not because they're forced to, but because they like it. And I've been in pretty revolutionary areas. I'm not saying I've been to Cuba, and I'm not saying I haven't. Sandinista Nicaragua, a lot of Sandinistas I had for students. That was a revolutionary movement in Nicaragua, but I wasn't there during the revolution, but after. I'm not that old. In the 2000s. But people love you, and that's part of soft power, right? So that's another doctrine, was to create instead of forcing people we're going to overthrow your government and install a dictatorship like in Guatemala, Chile, etc., to create policies where people like us. And that's very, very important doctrine. And then there are other movements of the bureaucracy that are usually created through certain events, like obviously 9/11. We created, the Department of Homeland Security and the Intelligence Reform and Prevention of Terrorism Act of 2004, which was to coordinate intelligence and avoid these failures. The CIA would say, who lost power with the 2004 Act under George Bush, the second one, would say, we didn't create a failure. You just ignored our policies or our suggestions. But the goal here to understand is two things. One, we lived in the post-World War II. What policies did we create, right? Different from after post-World War I. And the idea of professionalizing the bureaucracy in U.S. foreign policy is one of the goals of U.S. foreign policy. So every time there's an event, right? Let's say, for example, World War II, then we want, the National Security Act, and then we want to professionalize our bureaucracy, not just have an ad hoc system. After 9/11, we wanted to coordinate policy better, so we created the Department of Homeland Security and the 2004 Intelligence Reform Act. Those are very important to coordinate policies. Then we have doctrines that kind of govern policy, containment, brinkmanship, soft power, etc. And then obviously, George Bush's after 9/11, you're with you're with us or you're against us, etc. I don't even know if that's a doctrine, but anyway, the goal there is to create coordination after 9/11, because there's a lot of intelligence failure. When we get into the intelligence part, we'll talk about that. A lot of coordination, but people say, and this is going to be important, that by changing these bureaucracies, they can be good. You want a good, stable bureaucracy in U.S. foreign policy, but does change matter? And when you look at Graham Allison, I teach him a lot because it's very important. He came up with the bureaucratic politics model. So that model basically challenges the idea that states in foreign policy are rational actors, meaning they collect information and do the best policy they want. That's not necessarily true, he said. He was studying the Cuban Missile Crisis and realized that it's really the pulling and hauling of these different bureaucracies that are creating policy. So it really depends not on a rational actor, meaning the best policy for the state, right? Like states are rational actors, right? Doing the best that they can with the information they have, but bureaucrats fighting for each other, with each other, against each other to get their policies. So a good example is the Iraq War. Like Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice were against the invasion of Iraq, right? Colin Powell, Assistant Secretary of State, said he was steamrolled over because you basically had Cheney, Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, leaning, having George Bush's ear, meaning George Bush II, was listening to them more so. So when you look at the invasion of Iraq, it's really not about a rational policy that weapons of mass destruction, stop 9/11, which you can't. It's basically based on the idea that these bureaucrats are fighting to get the president's ear. Because think about it, the president himself doesn't really know much, right? Because I mean, they're not foreign policy experts. George Bush in particular wasn't the most well-rounded president, so they depend on these aides. But it goes for everyone, not just Bush, but just to take a Democrat to show I'm not being biased. Obama's invasion of Libya was a disaster. Who was he listening to? You have to look at the bureaucracy. So when you look at the bureaucracy, you look at these articles like the turf wars with the CIA and the State Department in Benghazi, where they actually killed an ambassador, right? That's a turf war. That's what we're talking about with the bureaucratic politics model. So the invasion of Libya was a disaster because by removing Gaddafi, now I personally don't like Gaddafi, but by removing him, you had all these people focusing on overthrowing Gaddafi, but once Gaddafi's overthrown, they start fighting each other. And that became a disaster. So Libya later, after Gaddafi was killed, obviously, they started fighting among themselves. And now it's a failed state. And a lot of the fighters on Gaddafi's side had to leave the country, and they went to Mali and other countries in Africa and created massive instability there, where France had to send troops after. So there's no real post-war in a lot of these policies like Iraq, Afghanistan. I find that there's a big problem with post-war development. And that leads us into, when the Berlin Wall fell, did the West and other countries, or could they have done better in Russia to stop the rise of Putin? Could have we done better to stop the rise of ISIS after Iraq? When you say, did we create ISIS with the invasion of Iraq? So we have all these policies, we have all these bureaucracies, we have all these doctrines, we have everything, like the invasion of Libya, getting rid of Gaddafi. But then after Libya became a failed state and these soldiers went and fought in African countries, because that's another problem. Like after the invasion of Iraq, we debaptized Iraq and told the people in the military, go, you have no job, but a bunch of people who have guns and know how to use them, they had to go join ISIS, because the new Shia government was going to create what they call Shia revenge, and that pushes people over the edge. We should have maintained Saddam Hussein's military and integrated other forces into it so those people didn't lose their jobs and then wouldn't go look for work elsewhere, and the only thing they really know how to do is kill people. You want to maintain it. This is what policy a lot of people don't know after the Salvadoran Civil War, which was very popular. We actually maintained the military and then integrated facts of the FMLN, that was the guerrilla group trying to overthrow it, into the military and police force, and that created stability. And then when and El Salvador is a very dangerous country, extrajudicial killings and things like that. So we can learn from policy. And our policies after a lot of these invasions, Libya, which was a disaster, there was no policy after. Iraq, which basically the DOD took over instead of the State Department. We debaptized the country. We got rid of, disbanded the military, which was crazy. Where do all these people go? That helped contribute to the growth of ISIS. So all of these things, we need good policy, good bureaucracy, etc. But what I like about Graham Allison's theory is that he says we need to focus on the people in the bureaucracy. So if you hate Joe Biden, you say Sleepy Joe. Or if you hate Donald Trump, you say Creepy Trump. It's really not about them always. It's about the people surrounding them. So that's what we have to study. And then we have to study doctrines. We have to study, invasions and then aftermaths of invasions, etc. So all of that is a lot to think about. But if you think about it, that's a solid idea to understand foreign policy. First, understand, the bureaucracy we developed, right? Like after World War II, after 9/11, and then look at the bureaucracies we create, and then look at the doctrines: containment, soft power, brinkmanship. Obviously George Bush's, you're with us or against us, the Bush doctrine, going after terrorism, where we actually said terrorism, non-state actors are a prime focus, and then Trump now with the rise of China and the rise of Russia. The Trump administration before Biden change the doctrine from non-state actors, sorry, and like terrorism, to now state actors with the rise of Russia, Iran, China is our biggest threat. So those are doctrines changing. So changes are always happening due to these things. And the rise of China, and now obviously the invasion of the Ukraine, changed doctrine. So it's no longer terrorism is the main focus, like Al-Qaeda, but now state actors. And that's important to ask, should we focus more on state actors? Because then we have to invest resources in other things, language skills, etc., opposed to non-state actors, counterinsurgency skills, which we're going to talk about later. So all of that is very, very important. So if you look at the list there, it's actually quite logical, right? So that's something you'll have to know on the quiz, and I'll send out like a little sheet. Well, this is what's going to be on the quiz. If you have any questions, again, community forum I really like, but think of all these kinds of theories, bureaucracies, doctrines, etc. We're talking about Monroe Doctrine, obviously the Roosevelt corollary. Did I say that right? Spanish-American War, all these things that happen, and then the bureaucracies that come, United States more expanding, invasions, the policies after invasions, did we do a good job here? How can we fix it, etc. And by the way, I want to note on the end of this, when the Taliban did take over in Afghanistan and took over our equipment, that's called the weapons of the weak, meaning these ragtag groups, like Mao once said, in China, when he took over China in 1949, he said Chiang Kai-shek, who he kicked out, was the best weapon supplier. And the Shining Path under Guzman in Peru said the same thing, where they would give these people, and this is going to be important for counterinsurgency, they would ambush tougher and bigger, usually supported by the United States or supported by Russia or something like that, groups, and then steal their equipment, and then they'd have their equipment. And that's one of the reasons why the Taliban took over so quickly. It wanted the equipment. It wanted to do it at rapid speed in order to get the equipment that the United States had to leave behind. Now, a lot of people say, oh, well, this was, an accident. No, the Taliban had a concerted effort to get that equipment, again, showing the failure of an invasion. And it's not just the United States that fails. A lot of countries fail in invasions. Che Guevara was killed in Bolivia. That was a big failure in other places. So it's not that it's just the United States, but we need better policy. So the Taliban wanted to take over that equipment rapidly. And people say, oh, they don't have the technology. They don't know how to read it, etc. But trust me, they'll learn. They wanted that equipment. So anyways, without further ado, reach out to me. Try to understand these lectures. I know the in-class runs fast, but I'm here still in Puerto Rico. I'm still not there. This was actually about a year or two ago, maybe before COVID. Yeah. And without further ado, thanks everyone for coming out and listening to my lectures. I deeply, deeply appreciate it.